Imagine waking up in a quiet valley, surrounded by mountains so high they seem to touch the sky. Then, in a single moment, that silence shatters into fire, chaos, and the sound of hundreds of enemies closing in. The Battle of Kamdesh is remembered for its intensity and sacrifice, and to truly understand it, we begin with its date and place. On October 3, 2009, in the remote mountains of Nuristan province in Afghanistan, a small American outpost known as Combat Outpost Keating became the center of one of the fiercest fights of the war. The location itself tells much about the struggle the soldiers would face. Combat Keating sat at the bottom of a deep valley, surrounded by towering ridges and steep terrain. This placement made it extremely vulnerable, because whoever held the high ground had an immediate advantage. The soldiers stationed there lived with a constant awareness that they were in a place difficult to defend, where every movement was watched, and every supply delivery was dangerous. The valley was not only isolated but also strategically important, as it was near key routes used by insurgents moving between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The soldiers were tasked with securing this rugged area, building relationships with local villagers, and trying to prevent Taliban fighters from gaining control. Yet from the very beginning, the outpost was criticized for its location. Its vulnerability was no secret to the men who lived there, who often spoke of the dangers of being trapped beneath the mountains. On that October morning, all of those fears became reality when the surrounding heights filled with enemy fighters. The date and place are not just details on a timeline, but the stage that shaped the entire battle. The valley's geography, the timing of the attack, and the isolation of the soldiers combined to create conditions that would test courage, endurance, and unity in ways few could ever imagine. The attack on Combat Outpost Keating at Kamdesh was not a small skirmish, but a massive and carefully coordinated assault. On the morning of October 3, 2009, as the soldiers inside the outpost went about their routines, nearly 300 Taliban fighters began their move. They had studied the terrain, knew the weaknesses of the outpost, and used the high ground to their advantage. From the ridges and rocky slopes surrounding the valley, they opened fire with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. The suddenness and scale of the attack caught many by surprise, though the defenders had long feared such a moment. The enemy came in waves, pressing down from all directions, encircling the small number of US and Afghan soldiers below. It was not just the volume of fighters, but also the precision of their plan that made the assault so devastating. They targeted guard posts, entry points, and even fuel and ammunition stores, trying to cripple the outpost's ability to fight back. The sheer noise of gunfire and explosions echoed through the valley, creating chaos and confusion. It was overwhelming for the soldiers inside, who found themselves under relentless pressure with enemies closing in. The attackers even breached parts of the outpost, forcing the defenders into desperate close-range fighting. The scale of 300 fighters against just over 50 defenders created a sense of near impossibility, as though survival itself was uncertain. Yet despite the ferocity of the attack, the soldiers held their ground, responding with discipline, calling in air support, and rallying together against odds that seemed insurmountable. The attack was not only meant to overrun the outpost, but also to send a message of strength, and its intensity became one of the defining features of the battle. The defenders of Combat Outpost Keating were placed in a position that few would envy. Numbering only about 54 US soldiers, along with a small group of Afghan allies, they were left to guard an outpost that sat exposed and vulnerable in the valley. To be so few in number in such a dangerous environment created a constant sense of tension. The men knew that if a large-scale attack came, they would be at a severe disadvantage. Every day required them to maintain alertness, with limited manpower to watch multiple positions, patrol the surrounding areas, and keep the outpost supplied. The isolation of Combat Keating made it even harder, as resupply missions were rare and often dangerous due to enemy activity in the mountains. Being so outnumbered on the morning of October 3 amplified the fear and chaos when the attack began. Against hundreds of Taliban fighters, The ratio of attackers to defenders was staggering, and the imbalance shaped the battle from its first moments. Soldiers had to move quickly between positions, often taking risks to help a comrade or to reinforce a weak point in the defense. In some cases, individuals were left to hold key spots alone, buying precious minutes for others to regroup. The small size of the defending force also meant that every loss, whether by injury or death, was felt instantly. There was no extra manpower to fill the gaps, so each man's effort became crucial to survival. This shortage forced acts of extraordinary bravery, as some risked themselves repeatedly to rescue the wounded or retrieve supplies under heavy fire. Being so few in number made the defenders' resistance all the more remarkable, as they stood against an enemy force that seemed overwhelming from every angle. The fighting that erupted during the Battle of Kamdesh was unlike the smaller clashes that had occurred before in the region. Once the Taliban began their assault, the battle quickly turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The attackers poured fire into the outpost from the ridges above, hitting guard posts, damaging equipment, and setting several buildings ablaze. Within moments, the defenders found themselves fighting not only against overwhelming numbers, but also against flames and smoke that choked the compound. The enemy pressed in close, breaching parts of the perimeter and forcing soldiers into hand-to-hand combat and short-range firefights. This was not a distant battle fought from safe cover. It was brutal, immediate, and personal. Ammunition ran low in some positions as soldiers fired back relentlessly, and the chaos of explosions shook the valley again and again. Requests for air support and artillery were sent out, but with the enemy so close, it was difficult to strike without endangering their own men. Despite the danger, Apache helicopters, jets, and mortars eventually provided critical firepower that helped slow the waves of attackers. Yet during those hours, the defenders could not rely solely on support from above. They had to move through open areas under heavy fire to rescue the wounded and recover weapons, showing acts of courage that came at great risk. The close-quarters nature of the battle meant that every corner of the outpost became a contested ground, where survival depended on determination and trust in one another. The heavy fighting stretched for hours, each moment a test of will, as soldiers fought to keep the enemy from taking full control of the outpost. It was an ordeal that pushed each man to his physical and emotional limits. Amid the chaos of the Battle of Kamdesh, the story of heroism and loss unfolded in ways that remain unforgettable. With the outpost nearly overrun and the enemy pressing from every side, individual soldiers made decisions that would define the fight. Some ran through open ground under a storm of gunfire to resupply their comrades, while others carried the wounded to safety even as bullets struck around them. The defenders knew they were vastly outnumbered, yet they refused to abandon one another. Acts of selflessness emerged again and again, driven not by orders alone but by loyalty to the men beside them. In the heat of the struggle, every action carried extraordinary risk, and many did not survive. 8 American soldiers lost their lives during the battle, and more than 20 were wounded, leaving scars that went far beyond the physical. Each death was deeply felt among the small force, as every soldier was a brother in arms, someone known personally, not just a name on a roster. The courage shown in those hours did not go unnoticed in the years that followed. Staff Sergeant Clinton Romeshaw and Staff Sergeant Ty Carter were later awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions, but their recognition also stood for the bravery of the entire unit. The loss was immense, yet the heroism shone just as brightly, reminding the world that even in the most desperate circumstances, people can rise to greatness through sacrifice and determination. The blend of courage and tragedy at Kamdesh turned the battle into a powerful story of human resilience. It showed how ordinary men, placed in extraordinary danger, chose to face fear head-on, protecting one another even when the odds suggested survival was nearly impossible. The legacy of the Battle of Kamdesh extends far beyond the smoke and fire of that October day. What happened there became one of the most decorated battles in modern U.S. military history, not only because of the honors awarded, but because of what those honors represented. Two soldiers, Staff Sergeant Clinton Romeshaw and Staff Sergeant Ty Carter, were each awarded the Medal of Honor for their extraordinary bravery, marking one of the rare occasions when two medals of honor came from the same battle. Many others received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts, showing how widespread the acts of courage were among the defenders. Yet the legacy is not only written in medals, it is also carried in memory and reflection. The loss of 8 lives was a wound that could not be erased, and the survivors carried the weight of both their sacrifice and their survival. For many, the battle became a lesson in leadership, resilience, and the consequences of placing troops in vulnerable positions. The decision to close Combat Outpost Keating shortly after the battle highlighted how the location itself had contributed to the danger. The story of Kamdesh also reached a broader audience through books, documentaries, and the film The Outpost, which sought to honor the men who fought there by showing the reality of what they endured. For those who study military history, the battle serves as an example of how courage and unity can overcome staggering odds, while also reminding leaders of the importance of strategy and preparation. The legacy of Kamdesh is therefore twofold. It is a tribute to the extraordinary bravery of the soldiers who stood together in the face of near defeat, and it is a reminder of the high cost of war in both human lives and lasting memory. The story of the Battle of Kamdesh is not just about a single day of combat, but about the human spirit tested at its limits. In a remote valley, far from home, a small band of soldiers stood against overwhelming numbers, fighting with determination, loyalty, and courage that echoed far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan. Their sacrifice reminds us that true strength is not measured by weapons or numbers, but by the willingness to protect one another even in the face of certain danger. The losses were heavy, and the scars remain, yet the legacy of their stand endures as a powerful example of resilience, unity, and the cost of freedom. When we remember Kamdesh, we do not only honor medals or history books. We honor the lives lived, the friendships forged, and the bravery shown in the darkest of hours.